Can I welcome everyone to our meeting? It's our 25th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2019. Can I remind everybody to turn off their mobile phones? And can I say at the outset that our convener, James Dornan, has submitted his apologies, so I shall be chairing the meeting today. That takes us to my first agenda item. For colleagues, our decision on taking our business in private. Can the committee consider and agree whether to take agenda items 4 in private? It's consideration of the evidence we've heard today in relation to our pre-budget scrutiny. Are we all agreed? Agreed. We are agreed. That's great. Can I also invite committee colleagues to agree to take in private future consideration of our draft report on empty homes and of our budget recommendations for the Scottish Government? That's our draft report on the 2021 budget. Is that agreed, colleagues? Thank you. And the final thing I need to ask you today is, colleagues, can we take item 5, which is about our future work programme in private? Yes. We can. That is great. Thank you very much. That leads us on to our agenda item 2, which is our pre-budget scrutiny. And we've got the opportunity to take evidence from the panel we have in front of us this morning. Our first panel is going to be representatives of housing-related organisations, and our second panel this morning will be from Professor Gibb from the University of Glasgow and Professor Mitchell from the University of Edinburgh. And the purpose of these evidence sessions is to help inform the letter that we're going to be writing to the Scottish Government over the next few weeks, suggesting issues for them to prioritise in next year's budget. And this committee has a long-term interest in housing policy and the future of local government. So the evidence we've been taking and will take today is crucial to that information. So can I come to our first panel this morning? And there's just one thing I need to put on the record first, which is in line with our parliamentary policy, we should avoid discussion or reference to the ongoing legal proceedings between Shelter and Glasgow City Council. That's a reference to an action Shelter has brought concerning Glasgow Council's policy on homelessness. So as I say that, I would like to stress that does not mean that we do not talk about homelessness in the round across Scotland, and there may be issues that members would rightly want to bring to the discussion this morning, and indeed to the panel members. Don't not talk about homelessness, it's just that one specific reference. I can see everybody nodding. Thank you very, very much for your understanding. So can we go to our panel today? Can I welcome you all? For the record, Fiona Kell, Director of Policy with Home for Scotland, Callan Chomsuk, National Director of the Chartered Institute of Housing Scotland, Craig McLaren, Director of the Royal Town Planning Institute, and Gordon McRae, Head of Communications and Policy at Shelter Scotland. Can I thank you all for your written submissions? They've been very helpful to us, and that enables us to move on to our questions this morning. Now, I would like to move across, I think it's to Graham Simpson. Yep. You're going to ask our first question this morning. Yeah, over to you, Graham.
Thanks very much. Morning, panel. Good to see you all. So obviously we're looking at the budget, and we'll have our own thoughts on what should be in that budget and what shouldn't be. You're all from the housing sector, and the remit of this council is this committee is councils. So I just wonder if you could tell us your thoughts on how budgets, cuts or otherwise, have affected your sector. You can all answer that.
I'll go first. Thanks for the question, Graham. I think noted by the Accounts Commission and a number of reports over the last couple of years, we've saw local government have been receiving a decreasing share of a decreasing budget. And I think for the housing sector and local authorities, that has been compounded by increasing responsibilities and duties placed on it. So with the development of rapid rehousing transition plans, proposed changes upcoming in temporary accommodation for focus on housing first, energy efficiency, obviously the 50,000 homes programme, and those are significant, and we can get into them. But if I can touch on the last one most importantly, 'cause I think that's the big pressure facing local government right now, as while over the last 3.5 years, the sector has really successfully delivered on the 50,000 affordable homes, and I think it's a testament to the deliverability of the sector to deliver massive infrastructure projects. What we have right now is a concern about the last phase of this programme and looking at the next affordable supply homes programme. What we have just that right now is the point where we should be scaling up towards the end of the affordable homes programme, so to get to that 50,000 homes. But right now we don't have any indicative sense from the Scottish Government about what the funding will be from April 2021. And as the committee will appreciate, that programme, if that was to be put in place, that work starts to begin now. So we're talking in the weeks and months ahead this very year. So unless we're actually seeing a clarity from the Scottish Government for what funding looks like from April 2021, we might find that local authorities are going to start winding down the programme for the beginning of 2021, which will undoubtedly have an impact on the affordable supply programme. So while we are broadly on track, and I think the sector and the government's money has been incredibly welcome, and we can certainly pick up the other issues I mentioned. I think the risk of uncertainty around what funding will look like for the affordable supply programme within the next Parliament is the biggest risk and biggest concern facing councils.
Okay, and before we move on to the rest, do you think we're on track to hit that 50,000 target?
Right now, absolutely right now. We had a report that came out Monday, again looking at evidence, and I think SFHA and Shelter had a report, I believe, last year that looked at the pace of development, and we are still broadly on track. I think everything points towards that. But if local authorities are going to start pulling back on investment, because ultimately they don't want to have 100% liabilities for developments that actually are landed on the 1st of April as opposed to March 31st, 2021, that will undermine our delivery. That's the potential to undermine delivery of the 50,000 homes. And I think that's certainly speaking to local authorities. That's the concern that they're feeling, that right now, as programmes should be getting developed, as should be initiated in the next few months for April 2021, there's risk of that pulling back.
Okay.
Yeah, from a planning perspective, and planning obviously is an enabler of the housing target. I think we're in a situation where we're finding that the planning service, a bit like the housing service, is there's an increasing demand for its services and for increasing burdens placed upon it. We've seen that from the Planning Act. We published some research recently which showed that the new Planning Act will introduce 49 new duties in local authorities. It could cost between £12 and £59 million to implement that over a 10-year period. Obviously, the 50,000 affordable homes is getting a pressure on planners as well. I think there'll be an increasing pressure with the zero carbon agenda because we need to plan for that. We need to make sure that we take a planned approach to it, which will need more planners. And that comes at a time when we've seen some fairly strong and large decreases in resources for planning. The last 10 years, we've seen a 25% decrease in planning staff, a 40% loss of budget. The net revenue spend on development planning and development management in local authorities is on average 0.34%, which is a tiny amount. And I think it's interesting, if you look to other people saying about planning as well, the Short Life Working Group looking at new housing and future construction skills, it talked about the need for support for planners to make sure that the planning targets could be delivered. So there's an issue there. We're coming to a bit of a crux point, I would argue.
Okay, right. Fiona.
Morning. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to address you this morning. I think from the point of view of Homes for Scotland and our members, we're fundamentally committed to the delivery of new homes across Scotland, regardless of tenure. And the target that we think is about 25,000 new homes per annum. And fundamental to the delivery of that is being able to have the support of local authorities in terms of planning, roads construction consent, building control warrants, etc. And consistently, the continued cuts, particularly in those departments, are undoubtedly having a knock-on effect on the ability to be continually delivering more homes. We know, for example, that only 11% of the 98 major housing applications across Scotland in 2018 and 19 were determined within the statutory deadline. So that's over 80% that weren't determined within that deadline, and that's an associated knock-on impact then on the ability to deliver new homes. And I think one of the key things that we want to get across is that it's not just about the delivery of new homes, but it's the associated benefits that the delivery of those new homes brings. So we know, for example, that the council tax revenue estimated, so for an estimated 25,000 new homes a year, if we were achieving that target, it would be circa £27 million a year brought into local authorities for council tax. So we want to get the message across that looking at investing in planning, building control, etc., is actually an investment into the delivery of homes and into your local economy. And I think that's a fundamental message that needs to be recognised.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I think one of the things that came up in previous sessions was that councils were rightly protecting statutory services, and it had been suggested that planning and transport issues were getting less resource. So that's the view from RTPI, particularly in terms of the resource.
Yeah, the planning budgets are being cut down considerably, as I've just said, and I think we're finding in planning that the focus is being on the statutory side of planning, which is where resources have been put, which is your development management and development plans. But quite often it's about around the edges, that creativity, which can actually make the differences around some of the things which Fiona's mentioned already. So we need to try and make sure we don't just stick to the real statutory stuff. The idea of actually putting planning in at the front of the process and having a clear idea as to what vision you can establish and how you can deliver that vision, that's really, really important. And I think that's getting lost a wee bit because we're losing a resource to do it.
So you mentioned low carbon, and we passed the Climate Change Act last week. We've also got the new Planning Act. So in terms of low carbon, what does that mean in practical terms across the country in terms of housing and planning?
I think I thought it was very interesting in the programme for government that for the first time ever, I think the First Minister's introduction mentioned the National Planning Framework as a key means of delivering the zero carbon agenda. And there were some quite interesting references throughout the document about how we needed to radically change the way in which we designed our towns and cities. So that will take time, that will take resource, that will take a change in how we do things. As I said, it might mean we have to get planning more in at the start of the process to be much more a corporate player in taking things forward, and bringing different parts and different services than local government and other public sector bodies together to try and make that happen. So I don't know, I can't quantify it just now, but I'm pretty sure it'll have a major impact.
Yeah. Callum, did you want to come in on that point?
On the kind of delivery of energy efficient homes, I mean, what we're finding right now is over the last, the committee will be kind of well aware, we've saw over the last year a kind of significant rise in the kind of rents of kind of social tenants across Scotland. So it's 3.7%, which is massively up from last year, which was 2.4%, and kind of around 80% of landlords are expecting to increase their rents again. Part of that is undoubtedly the 50,000 homes they were delivering. These are, you know, partly funded, half funded by tenants through their rents and the kind of the debts that landlords are taking on to build these new homes. Part of that is also around the kind of delivering more energy efficient homes. And I think it's an interesting discussion around, actually, there is a point in which tenants can't continue to pay for more and more energy efficiency measures. The returns that they're seeing on the kind of cost savings are starting to get out of sync with the extra costs that's been put upon their rent. And there's a balance between how much we expect tenants to pay for that and how much money was going to come from central government to actually support these energy efficient measures. I think if we're in a state of a climate emergency and we agree that a lot needs to be done, it can't simply just be as a consequence of putting rents further and further on tenants, that we need to see more investment from central government. I know ex-HAS have kind of made representations to the committee before around seeing a doubling in the kind of energy efficiency budget. There are more that needs to come from central government to address this.
So come back in.
Do you want to come back, Graham?
Yeah, before we go on to you, Gordon, because you'll be talking about homelessness, presumably. If we can stick to Fiona and Craig, and you've both spoken about the pressures in planning and building control. Craig, you mentioned the extra money that is going to be required as a result of the Planning Act. Some of us are to blame for that. So I guess you'd be looking for at least a nod to extra resources for planning and building control in the budget.
I know that Scottish Government are currently drafting a paper looking at what the resourcing future will be for the planning service, and we're hopeful that will be a mechanism to start and have some discussions around. For example, planning fees just now only cover about 2/3 of their costs. So if we can move towards something which actually covers their costs, it would be good things. There are some provisions within the Planning Act which allow for more discretionary funding. So I know local authorities are currently looking at different ways in which they can charge for some of their services, be that for pre-application advice, which some authorities do just now, but there might be other things they're looking at as well, so we want to explore that, absolutely. But yeah, there's from our perspective, there's a need to increase planning fees to make sure you can actually get the service which you require. And if we're giving planning application fees below the cost of actually processing, that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Based on some recent research with our members, they estimated that over the period 2013 to 2018, the average length of time to get a building warrant over that 5-year period was just short of 60 weeks. So we fully welcome the commitment to low carbon and a climate emergency. We fully understand where we're coming from. However, if you're going to be placing additional burdens on building control in particular to be resourcing these requirements, then I think it's essential that they are adequately resourced in order to be able to deliver that, because an average of 60 weeks over the last 5 years is not going to improve if we don't resource it and we place an additional burden for additional building standards, which is we welcome, but it just needs to be resourced appropriately.
Okay, as a quick supplementary.
So the other thing I should have mentioned is that what happens just now with planning fees is that they go into a big local government pot. And there is perhaps a need to look at how we make sure that that money which is generated through planning fees is actually put back into processing planning applications. Heads of Planning Scotland done some research looking at that there was an increase in the maximum planning fee for major planning applications introduced a couple of years ago. And Heads of Planning Scotland done some research on that and found that they could only work out where about a third of local authorities actually got that reinvested in the planning service.
Okay, that's a useful statistic for us. Gordon, you haven't come in on this overall issue about funding for services.
Well, I think I would echo very much the concerns that have been expressed about the cliff edge we're facing with the social house building programme, and I think having due regard for the potential loss of skills that will come if uncertainty continues there, you're actually, even if there are new plans coming forward, we need to check that we still have the ability to deliver on them. But I wanted to pick up the point around the kind of withdrawal of local authorities to statutory services, and we are seeing that very much in the homelessness side of the equation, where we think there is now a crisis of enforcement. We have local authorities, multiple local authorities, who are acting by their own figures that they put into the Scottish Government. They're acting unlawfully. We recognise why that is. In no small part, it's because some of the other services which are not statutory have been under pressure, and the homelessness service is very often where those problems land. So when we look at the last year's homelessness statistics, we're seeing homelessness on the rise across nearly every indicator for the second year in a row. There was one exception, and that was on prison leavers, and literally 2 weeks after those statistics were published, the Scottish Prison Service announced they were suspending the through care service that had done so much to introduce the shore standards to ensure that people leaving prison actually are settled in a good place. So we're very anxious that the people who rely on local government services are being systematically let down, that there is not sufficient focus on homelessness services in particular. These are legal duties. We wouldn't accept legal duties towards provision of education, towards provision of other public services to go unchallenged. And we think there's opportunities for local authorities to do more. And just to pick up the point about statutory services, if we look at things like empty homes, there's a really cheap way for local authorities to bring some properties back into use. But not all 32 local authorities as yet have empty homes officers. If we look at the role of the private rented sector, there's a lot that can be done to support the good landlords that are out there to deliver professional services, but it requires in part local authorities to invest in things like private rent sector officers to support that good practice. Those are good investments that local authorities can make, which will then impact, we believe, on the provision of statutory services and reduce some of the burden that local authorities are seeing.
Okay, well, just to pick up a follow-up on that, there has been new money for homelessness. So where's the disconnect?
Well, there's £50 million over I'm going 3 or 5 years, I can't quite recall, 3 years. It's significant, but it's not. It's going quite. It's spread quite broadly. We look at new innovations like Housing First, shelter. We provide a Housing First service in Manchester. We very much support the model, but we're concerned that it's being scaled up at too quick a pace, that we've not yet got the evidence in place. We've not the transition for local authorities to get there is taking place over quite a short period of time, and certainly we have a real lack of confidence in the leadership of some local authorities who have been systematically failing to deliver their legal duties just now to be the same people that lead that transition to a new service. So it's not just about money, it's about practice and enforcement, and that's really a leadership role for senior managers in local authorities and elected members to hold them to account.
Okay.
So,
Graham, do you want to follow up there?
without touching on any council in particular, are you suggesting that some councils are deliberately not meeting the legal requirements?
Well, I think I can't talk to the intent, but I can only look at the numbers, and we have multiple local authorities year on year reporting breaches of unsuitable accommodation orders, breaches of multiple local authorities failing to accommodate. They haven't taken steps to eradicate that, and those are legal duties placed on the local authority. Those are not just performance measures to keep abreast of how well they're doing. And the people that we work with, there are human consequences to that. When we talk about what council's priorities are for financial stability, we think about what the people who rely on the services concerns are, and it's about ensuring that they can access the right advice, the right support, and the right housing when they need it, and that's not universally the case now in Scotland.
Okay, anyone else want to come back on this one?
Just to pick up the point around kind of temporary accommodation, it has been it's a challenge, and I think I said at the outset that local authorities are constantly having extra duties and responsibilities placed on them. We had at earlier this year, every local authority agreed its rapid rehousing transition plans, and then subsequently the Scottish Government rightly consulted on kind of new unsuitable accommodation orders. Now we all support that. I think everybody in the room would support that, kind of minimising the use of inappropriate temporary accommodation is an absolute positive thing. But simply placing more and more duties on local authorities to meet these expectations without providing adequate resources is going to lead to more. Is ultimately going to lead to more breaches. That was the case a couple of years ago when we saw a strengthening and a kind of limited use of inappropriate accommodation. Where we saw, I think, breaches rose from 165 in 2017 to 345 in 2018. So simply placing more and more duties on the councils won't deliver the change we need. We need to see either money, resource, new stock. Fundamentally, kind of a lot of ways, all roads lead back to supply, and unless we actually find local authorities to deliver that, then we are going to hear more kind of breaches and lack of enforcement.
Okay, thanks for that. That was our first two questions. Can I move on to the issue about longer term funding, because that's one of the issues that the committee was keen to explore about the sustainability of local government finance, and it's something other witnesses have been giving us evidence on. And the question I have is, how would longer budget settlements, for example over 3 years, enable local authorities to provide preventative services? You've given us some examples of where local authorities are not currently providing, and given us examples of lots of new duties. Would longer term budgets enable people to react better at the local level, and how would you monitor and evaluate the impact?
I could come in on, certainly from a third sector perspective, if local authorities have longer term budgeting, then they're in a position to procure services from partners over a longer period of time, and that brings stability, and it brings the development of expertise. And one of the real struggles that the third sector faces is year-on-year budgeting. You know, we're very often in a position where a successful service that can be evaluated against the local authorities' duties and responsibilities exists with a sword over its head, because we don't know where, you know, when we come to March, we don't know whether we're going to have the money, and that's not due to a lack of desire by the purchasers, by the local authority. It's very often a consequence of the way in which local government settlements take place. So from our view, people who struggle to access services would have more ability to access stable services if there was more stable funding out there, both for local authority services but also for the third sector.
Yep, Callum.
Yeah, so echoing a little bit what I said earlier, though, I mean, the part of the success of the Affordable Housing Supply Programme has been that the guarantee of money over a 5-year period, and that I talk about deliverability of the sector. That's because we've had that confidence that money is going to come in, and I know that Fiona's members will actually, it supports the private sector. Investors will look at affordable housing as a you know, a sure thing over this 5-year period. That's given us a huge confidence. Where, as I mentioned earlier, where we get to a sticky point is that cliff edge where we're moving between cycle to cycle. And while I recognise there's always going to be a finite amount of time a cycle will end, there needs to be a better consideration around that transition. Similarly, I think when we look at something like Housing First, now Housing First, I think the committee done a really good inquiry into kind of homelessness, and Housing First absolutely stands out as the solution to supporting those with some of the most severe and multiple needs. But we need to ensure that the money and the political will be there. It is a new model. There are risks. It is perhaps not hitting the scale in which was envisioned originally to deliver the 830 homes over 2 years, although I'm fairly confident we will get there. So we need, I think local authorities need that commitment that the money is there so they can put their own political will behind it. Otherwise we will not only compromise the programmes that we've committed to, but we're going to let down the people who we said we'd commit to, because Housing First is a commitment to support people no matter what.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to briefly come in if you
want?
Yeah,
just briefly. It's a simple fact that building new homes takes time. It's not something that can be done overnight. So if you're planning through right from identifying a site that's possibly a brownfield site, maybe with contamination that needs remediated, you may need new roads put in, then you get to the stage of actually building the houses. So that's not something that's done on an annual basis. It's not something that can run from March to March. So I think having that longer term certainty will assist, regardless of the tenure that you're building, will certainly assist in being able to deliver more homes.
I think that point's been well made. Craig?
Yeah, I think 3-year budgets would be useful. And from a planning department perspective, most of their budget's on staffing, to be honest with you. But having that ability to plan your staff over that 3-year period and for them to be committed to the 3-year term would actually help to look at how we could make best use of other services which have capital budgets which can be used to provide services, infrastructure and things like that as well. So having that more planned approach, because I've always said that good planning is preventative spend in action, because if you can make sure you have those discussions at the start of the process, you plan things properly, you get a place which works properly, you don't have to mop up the pieces later on. And if we're doing working to very short term, so often that doesn't happen. So this more considered approach would actually help with that, I would imagine.
Okay, that takes us very neatly on to our next question about preventative spend. Andy, you were going to come in on that one?
I will in a second, yes. I just want to pick up a couple of points. First, Craig, in your evidence, you talk about the fact that some of the income allocated to local authorities by government is protected for particular purposes, such as pupil equity funding, etc. And you go on to say that considering the severe nature of the resource-facing planning service, RTPI Scotland would advocate the committee consider comparable arrangements to be put in place for planning services. In other words, the committee should recommend to the government that we ring-fence planning money. Ring-fencing is something I'm not comfortable with. The principal duties in relationship to planning lie with local government. It's up to them to allocate their resources. You have welcomed the chief planning officers, which will give a higher corporate focus to planning. I totally understand the resourcing question, don't get me wrong. I just want your views on whether it's really, is that really the appropriate solution to ask government to tell local government what to do, or are there other ways we could go about doing this?
I think we need to make the case for, in some way, the money which is generated through planning fees, for example, to be invested back into the planning service.
Yeah, get that.
How that's done, I don't really care, but I do want it to happen. So we have talked to government about this. We've talked to Derek Mackay about it, and he says it's an issue with councils. The government can't do it. So we are trying to look at this on two fronts, both to see if the government can help us with that idea, but also if we can convince local authorities of the importance of planning and helping them to deliver their broader objectives. What I think people quite often forget is that if you want to build more homes, you need to have planners processing planning applications and putting in place development plans to show where things will go and where the infrastructure will go to provide that. So we're trying to make a much more a much better case to show the value that planning can bring. And an example of that is my colleagues in RTPI Cymru done some work a couple of years ago looking at the value of planning and what it brought in to local authorities, and it was £2.3 billion a year in terms of land value uplift, in terms of planning fees, in terms of lots of other things as well. So we're trying to make the case. We just think it's really important that it happens.
Okay, I mean, I think you have the support of this committee, I think, for elevating the role of planning in this, and I'll come back to that on the question of preventative spend because I think it's important. Is a question for Gordon at Shelter. In your evidence, you talk about, in your preamble, you say Shelter Scotland helps over 500,000 people every year struggling with bad housing or homelessness through our advice, support and legal services. Of those 500,000 people, roughly how many people are coming to you because they're homeless?
I don't have a figure to hand, but that number comes largely from things like advice, visits to our Get Advice website. Roughly
how many? I mean, half, quarter, three quarters?
Given that the number of homeless people in applications is in the region of, what, 35,000, the biggest issue people come to us with is the private rented sector. So it tends to be pre-homelessness people are coming to us for advice.
Okay, so it was on that I wanted to question, because that's my impression. The vast bulk of these inquiries is not directly about homelessness, but people dealing with bad housing, rents, repairs, whatever. I mean, where in that space, so with people who are housed but have issues, should we be considering the role of local government and spending and budgets, etc.?
Well, the largest single place that, or the biggest increase that we're seeing in people who are applying as homeless, when they're asked where were they staying before, is from the private rented sector. So there is clearly a role, we would argue, as we have in our submission, for local authorities to take a bigger leading role when it comes to supporting good private landlords to avoid the rise in homelessness that we're seeing coming from the private rented sector. And there have been good initiatives in the last few years. We've got greater security coming in, but we know that there is a large non-professional private rented sector. Landlords, the majority of landlords tend to have one or two properties. They may be accidental. They're not professionals in of themselves. They lack support. They're trying to navigate what is quite a complex system. Local authorities have an interest in preventing, as part of the preventative spend, to reduce the demand on homelessness services by improving the standard of private rented sector. And I think there's been some work we did with the Oak Foundation that has made some recommendations that certainly identifies the benefits that local authorities can gain from private rented sector officers or working with the landlord organisations to drive up standards locally.
Okay, that's helpful. So that brings me to the question about preventative spend, because it's certainly my view that housing is a critical element in terms of alleviating and preventing a lot of problems that come down the line. You talked about the private rent sector. I've got constituents who can no longer afford their rent. They're now homeless. They're in the Edinburgh Council's homeless service. That costs a fortune compared to the living in the private rented sector. I've got constituents who are being evicted because of short-term lets. They're struggling. So we're creating problems and potential costs. So, what role does housing play in preventative spend, in justice, in NHS, in other areas of public expenditure? And how can we better account for preventative spending? Because you require double investment. You need to keep going with what you're doing, and you also need to invest in avoiding that in the future. So I'd be very interested, because you've all got a lot of experience in this area, and I mentioned to Craig, obviously planning's got a critical role to play in this. So I'm just getting some very broad thoughts about how we might go about that, because to my mind, we haven't really cracked that nut yet.
Well, I was certainly point to yesterday's publication by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which identified some of the factors in poverty in Scotland. And I think this leads into many of the opportunities there are around preventative spend. And it showed quite clearly that Scotland's relatively lower social rents was the major factor in poverty difference between England and Scotland. Now, arguably, that's because of bad decision making south of the border rather than always positive decision making up here. But I think it does demonstrate that investing in social house building, new social housing, is one of the best forms of preventative spend, whether it's around child poverty, whether it's around climate change, or whether it's around just building good communities. Social housing is a major driver of social good, and we would certainly argue that when it comes to capital expenditure, the best pound that a local authority or the national government can make in multiple areas of the national outcome framework is to invest in new social housing.
I think so. In our written evidence, we briefly touched upon this respects to housing first, and we kind of drew upon an example, like evidence from England, and made the point that if housing first was rolled out across England, it would lead to around £200 million savings. So investing in housing first is preventive spending. But I think the kind of heart of your point, Andy, is actually how do we ensure that in the housing sector we are dealing with a lot of the taking on a lot of the burdens for delivery, but a lot of the kind of the savings are realised in other. In health or in criminal justice, and I agree. I'm unfortunately I don't have an answer. I wish I could say this is a way to kind of ensure that the sector claws that back. I think for us it's about trying delivering on that housing first and ensuring that health and other sectors actually are contributing towards the delivery of these services like housing first at a proportionate scale, so that responsibility doesn't sit on housing. But I don't think we have a clear means in order to, refinance housing from the kind of the preventive spend savings that will be accumulated from that. I think the point Fiona mentioned earlier though as well is really important around the economic growth that comes from house building. It's this is a sure thing as you can get, and actually in helping grow local economy and creating jobs. I think we've got that benefit of not only delivering on the kind of social good with programs like Housing First, but we've got a kind of a local economic benefit that comes from housing.
You did imply just a few moments ago, you said, I think you indicated that potentially the health service should invest in housing. Mm-hmm. I mean, if a good, affordable, warm home is what's going to make someone better, why shouldn't some of that money come from the health budget?
Absolutely.
You were saying that, weren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Uh-huh. I think when you look at the health outcomes for those that are homeless, actually, I think they're noted in our written evidence. They're horrendous. Actually, it's an absolute appropriate use of kind of health budget to support someone's kind of housing condition. If we live, everyone can seem to recognise that we've all kind of spoke to it repeatedly before, that if we can invest in healthier homes for people, we will reduce the kind of health inequalities and poor health outcomes, and that is a benefit to the NHS.
Okay, thanks. Any others?
I think if we build sustainable, livable communities and places to a high standard, that will undoubtedly improve people's health, their mental health, their well-being. If we make sure there's sustainable and active travel built into all that as well, it will undoubtedly have an impact on people's health and well-being as well. If we build our communities to make sure that they reach the zero carbon targets, it means we will be picking things up early on, so we won't have to spend money later on as well. So from a planning perspective, I think we can build communities if we do that properly, which stops us from having to spend money later on. I think there's an important role here for the Chief Planning Officer, which has been put through the new Planning Act. And just now the provisions are merely for the appointment of the Chief Planning Officer. There's work to be done on guidance which comes out as to what role that Planning Officer should have. And I think it could be quite pivotal in trying to bring together early in discussions around asset management and policy and financial decisions made by a council as to how we can make sure we future-proof how we take forward our communities and how we build our assets. So bringing in your Director of Education, the Health and Social Care Partnership to think things through about how the place would work better could bring that preventative spend agenda, but we need to make sure the guidance allows us to do that and gives the Chief Planning Officer the ability to be heard by those other people within a corporate management team or whatever as well. So there is a real opportunity there, I think, to try and make sure the places we deliver give us the preventative spend. And I think as part of that, as you've already mentioned, we should be looking to see how the budgets, health budgets, for example, can actually be used to help with that, because they won't need to do the reactive stuff later on.
So you're suggesting there that if planning has a higher profile within local government, earlier discussions around priorities and budgets and asset management can identify the kind of savings that preventative spend is intended to do, but can short-circuit that process by identifying right up front. So do you accept that there's a contradiction between that approach, which I agree with incidentally, and the approach that seeks to ring-fence critical funds, because then they become beyond negotiation at that stage? You know, there's a somewhat tension between the two approaches.
I'm perhaps being selfish and say we should ring fence for planning. We bring in other funds from elsewhere. So it's maybe trying to catalyse the planning funds. But I understand what you mean, that there's a need for a sort of fluidity amongst funding to try and recognise that if you are building communities which work better, that will mean budgets later down the line will not be required.
So it would be better to characterise this as breaking out of silos in education and social work and environmental services, etc., to try and optimise outcomes by spending all the money in a better way. Would that be fair?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's what I anticipate the Chief Planning Officer role to be, is to be that integrator and to have that eye to the longer term as well as the short term decision making. So yeah, and so you need to support them to do that, but they should be bringing together all those different budgets to try and make that happen.
Okay, thanks so much, Convener.
Excellent. That takes us quite neatly, I think, onto where Alexander is going to take us next and his questions.
Thank you. In the shelter submissions, you talk about the long-term stability of local government and the problems that faces, and you indicate that service transformation is needed, but that takes a management capacity, and it also has to have the transformation funding to go along with that. And we've covered in this morning already by some of my colleagues about the priorities that councils may have, the priorities that government may have, and there seems to be a disconnect at times between what their aspirations that they're trying to achieve. So when we're looking at the current financial settlements that we have and the powers that come with that financial settlement, we can look at examples of, for example, an IJB, and you've just talked about how you feel that health should be integrated into the process. But can I ask about what you think that there is councils will have been able to achieve in doing that by having something like an IGB that gives them the opportunity to try and bring together. But we've heard that hasn't always worked on the ground within councils at the present time. There are some difficulties, and funding is always going to continue to be a problem because the change in dynamics and the change in the aged population and all the rest of it, that there's not enough. And you've talked about the silos that are there. So can I maybe ask each of you to think about how you would manage that to ensure that there is that connect when we're talking about the current financial settlements that we do get?
I mean, it does link into the previous conversation around ring fencing, and it's been mentioned in passing the investment that has gone into housing first and rapid rehousing plans. And whilst there's no question that's getting to the front line, it is worth noting that the Scottish Government don't actually have a lever by which to direct that investment specifically to those priorities. It does go into the pot, and it's done on the basis of an agreement with the local authority that will go there. So I think there is a challenge around how national priorities are resourced and whether those resources are always directed properly to where they need to be. On the question of joint working, I think there is good work going on. NHS Scotland have a big focus on health and homelessness. I think, like many large bureaucratic organisations, the reality of what the aspiration is and how that actually percolates to the front line can be very challenging. And there is, frankly, a cultural shift that needs to take place. And that's why I come back to our concerns about leadership in some local authorities, because it's not just about money, it's about corporate will, it's about prioritising, it's about ensuring that the people in leadership roles have the space to drive the change that's required. And with so many competing priorities, that's it's not always fair to expect a local government officer to be able to balance all of those national, local and health priorities. So we do think that the housing and homelessness system in particular suffers from a bad dose of initiative-itis. There's always something new. There's always something new to be getting on with. But actually, this is relatively straightforward. People have basic housing rights that need to be enforced, and there is a chronic shortage of supply. If we can address both of those things and do it in partnership with those public bodies, not just local authorities, but the justice system, the health system, then all parts of the public sector will benefit. There is some research going on. It's not yet in a place where it can be shared as to what the economic benefits of social housing are, what the social benefits are of I think RSL housing, and I know there's academics working on these things just now. So there is, I think, more evidence coming as to how we can do that. But for this local government settlement, I think it is about saying, truly, what are the priorities that we're asking local authorities to deliver on? And let's give people the space to go off and do that without bringing in another ask 12, 14 months later.
Do other members of the panel have any views on that? Fiona?
Yes, slightly different tack on that, but we certainly are of the very strong view that in south of the border, there's a very clear target, 300,000 homes per annum. Now, regardless of whether or not that target is actually achieved, regardless of what the number is, I think what that's sending out is a very clear vision, a very clear message that housing is a priority. So certainly the feedback we're getting from our members who are building both north and south of the border is that they are finding that there is often a more joined-up approach to the delivery of new homes across agencies in England, because there is a very clear message that we are all focused on delivering new homes. And we feel strongly that having a similar target with the message that sends could certainly help to unite the industry in its widest sense, so various public agencies, the private sector. We think it could help unite to deliver more homes if there was that very clear vision and target. That certainly is the anecdotal evidence that we're hearing from our partners in England.
Thank you. Okay.
Can I bring a planning specific perspective on it? There is a changing agenda to the way in which the planning service and planning system will be taken forward given the new Planning Act. There's a need to try and think about how we actually help make sure we've got the people with the right skills, behaviours, knowledge sets and organisations with the right culture to deliver that. And I think we all recognise and welcome that. I think as a profession we're keen to see how we can do that. Moving towards a more outcomes-based approach I think is good. There are a couple of things for that which I think are important to bear in mind, which I can maybe help drive those different behaviours. One is there is some thinking going on just now about the future of a sort of planning performance framework for planning authorities, and that will obviously drive behaviours, so we need to think about that, and I think going to a more outcomes-based approach might give us some better measures of how we measure the success of planning than we do just now, which is essentially quite obviously through the speed of processing a planning application. That is important, but there are other factors when you think about it as well, like including the quality of the development on the ground. And there's a role, I think, there for the new National Improvement Coordinator, which has been established through the Act as well, because they have a role to measure performance and to drive the performance framework. So I think we need to think about that. The other thing is about how we can prepare people working in planning departments, but also all the people who contribute to the planning service to make sure they have the skills to take that forward as well. And if you look back to the last Planning Act in 2006, there was a fund called the Planning Development Programme, £1.2 million over 3 years, which supported that culture change initiative. There's nothing like that in place thus far. We are doing some thinking just now, which we're calling a performance offset, whereby you look at planning fees as they come in, and you take 1%, for example, from that.
Yep.
To invest into a pot which would help with that, and that could be something which could be helping local authorities and others. It could be something that could be used to support the office of the National Planning Improvement Coordinator as well. That would bring in, if it's 1%, it would bring in about 250 grand a year, which is not insignificant to help with that sort of work.
Callum, you want to?
Yeah, just very briefly, building on some of the points that Gordon and Fiona said, I think where we saw kind of leadership from the Scottish Government, actually we saw a real difference in the delivery. So when it comes to rapid rehousing transition plans, delivery housing first, affordable supply programme, that has helped catalyse a lot of the relationships. It's actually allowed us to kind of change things. That leadership really makes a difference. I think what has been disappointing, and Gordon touched on this earlier, was where actually we saw changes and improvements regarding kind of the shore standards and actually the relationship between local authorities and prisons. Actually, where we're seeing improvement, we've had a pull back on that, and actually sort of change in approach to the prison service. So where that political will comes from, I think it forces organisations like the Health Service to actually get involved and actually work with the housing sector to deliver on outcomes. Where there is less attention, there's less focus, we're finding that more challenging to kind of catalyse those relationships.
I mean, you've all made some very strong points on that, and I think that the reality of it is that councils are struggling. They've dealt with efficiency savings, they've dealt with the redesign of their services. Some people would call that cuts in the process. And what they are trying to do is manage the crisis. You Gordon, called it a cliff edge that we were facing. Other people in some of their submissions have said that the funding statements and the way that they are resourced is unsustainable going forward. So if that is the case, if we are at that unsustainable situation and we are at that cliff edge, where do you see us going from here if there is not the priority given and the resource behind it, and in the future that the system will continue to crack at the seams, and only specific projects that are given real push by specific government may well be the ones that go forward and other ones slightly diminish and disappear?
I think we have to look at the tax base that local authorities are able to draw on. It's increasingly narrow. National priorities are funded through national money, and local authorities are quite constrained in their ability to raise local money for local priorities. So whilst we don't have a view on what that new system should be, we certainly think that the time is now to look differently at local taxes. Property taxes are an important part of that. It is an important part of a stable housing market to ensure that the housing wealth and that land values are actually accommodated within the tax system. But that is if it's allowed just to continue as it is unchecked, it is going to get to an unsustainable place, and we don't want the people most vulnerable in society to be the ones that suffer.
Okay. Any other comments from anybody? Yeah.
I can just looking at it very practically. There are some things which I've talked about already, which can be quite short-termish in their approach, but it could help. We can generate more income in terms of planning through planning fees, through reinvesting properly than we do just now as well, and through full cost recovery. We are looking at processes and adapting processes as well, again, to try and make sure that we only deal with the things we need to deal with rather than all the other stuff. And there is some work about to start, I think, on looking at, for example, permitted development rights and planning, which might take some cases out of the system, which might not necessarily need to be looked at. We can look at digital. There's a digital planning task force being established to look at how we can use digital to speed things up and to make things more effective. I think there's some stuff there. And I think for me, there's still a debate about how we fund the infrastructure which supports housing. We've had that debate through the Planning Act in many ways as well. But I'd still wonder if there's a need to try and explore things like land value capture to try and make sure that we can bring in some funding, because everyone's pleading poverty over funding infrastructure.
Just one quick final point. I think it's just to make the point that it's not just spending. Local authorities aren't just spending. If you're spending money in housing, you're investing. Yeah. And I think that's an important message to get across, that you're investing and you are getting a return on that. So whether that's in terms of the tax raised, investment into additional school or education facilities or community facilities through Section 75 contributions, etc. So I think it's just about some of the language as well. It's not just saying about spending, it is genuinely about investing.
Thank you.
Okay, can I just pick up that point about investment, because we have rightly had a really strong focus on new housing. I just wondered about the existing housing stock we've got. You mentioned briefly, I think, energy efficiency. I was wondering about the accessibility issue in the context of people being able to stay in their homes longer. Is there anything there? I think the stats are that it's adaptations budget frozen for 7 years. I was just wondering, given the demographic pressures, whether anyone's got any comments they want to make about that as a cross-cutting preventative measure. Callum, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, so I mean, actually, it's an interesting mix. So while absolutely we have a kind of ageing population, actually you'll find kind of the mix of social tendencies are actually a little bit different. We are finding the makeup is more of kind of younger families. So there's perhaps there's less concern around maybe some of the adaptations for some of the new entrants to the social sector in the way that you might look across the broader population, but it doesn't undermine the kind of thrust of your question, that actually we obviously need to be building homes to kind of a higher standard, a kind of more accessible standard, kind of increasingly energy efficiency. And kind of going back to my first point again, actually the only way we're going to do that is if we keep investing. We give the kind of the sector, we give the local government and give the housing association, give everyone the certainty that money is going to be invested. If we get to a cliff edge, if we drop off come March 2021 and we're having to scale back up again for the following 6 months, we're wasting time, energy and money. We need to see a continuation so we can address some of the big challenges that the sector is facing.
Okay, thank you for that. Gordon, did you want to come in?
Can I just pick up? There is one issue that local governments do need to start thinking about now, which is related to the adaptations budgets, and that is we have a 50+ population now living in the private rented sector, who traditionally would have seen their housing benefit in retirement cover their social rent, or would have presumably paid off their mortgage and not had to look at the housing costs. We now have the prospect of older renters who have no other recourse, who are going to need support, and they're living in not always, but usually low standard housing. That's going to take more investment to bring it up to a standard that can keep them in that home if they need it when they maybe acquire disabilities in later life.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm now going to move across to Annabelle.
Okay. Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. We've had a very interesting discussion thus far. Just picking up on the generality of the issue of funding, I think that there's certainly one elephant in the room here that has not been touched upon, but was highlighted by the Chartered Institute of Housing, Scotland's paper, at paragraph 3.8, where they state that the UK government's welfare reform programme has had and will continue to have a significant negative impact on hundreds of thousands of households across Scotland. It goes on to say Scottish Government estimates that the UK Government welfare reform measures will have removed £3.7 billion from Scottish households by 2020 to 2021. The loss of income means that more households are struggling to pay for essentials, including rent, heating, food and clothing, and relying more on local services to support them. So I think in terms of our general conversation, I think it's very important to note that particular elephant in the room. And I just wonder if the panel feel, in light of what has been said already this morning, that whether, therefore, it is the role of the Scottish Government, the devolved Scottish Government with devolved powers and a limited devolved budget, not having access to the entirety of Scotland's resources, do the panel feel, therefore, that the Scottish Government should mitigate every single, or seek to mitigate every single negative impact of UK government policy?
So I think when, absolutely, I mean, there's a huge scale of kind of welfare cuts, and looking at the kind of freezing of local housing allowances, obviously put massive pressures on people in the private rented sector, which undoubtedly making the private rented sector more unaffordable in cities like Edinburgh will ultimately put pressure on kind of, local authorities in order to address people that are homeless. And that's ultimately the building social housing is a good thing. We need more social housing. The scale of the programme that we've built over the last 3.5 years has we're almost at a standstill given the kind of the demolitions and that have had ongoing in the sector. So I don't see it as mitigating building social housing as mitigating welfare reform. I see social housing as addressing the need that exists in Scotland. We have waiting lists over 100,000. We are ending right to buy, and this scale programme is only beginning to get standstill. Building for the next Parliament will start to really address some of the issues, and as Gordon talked about earlier, actually the research from Joseph Rowntree demonstrates that has really helped kind of keep downward pressure on poverty in Scotland. So I think building social housing is a good thing in itself, and building housing all across all territories is just a good thing in itself, and I'd probably focus on that way rather than mitigating undoubtedly the awful impact of some of the welfare cuts.
Well, indeed, and I understand what you say. However, if we take the £3.7 billion figure being removed from households in Scotland, that has an enormous impact. And the kind of catch up in trying to alleviate the damage that does involves money, and that requires to come from a budget in devolved Scotland. If you then say that is to be spent to mitigate UK government policy, that has to come from some other budget. That is the way things are at the moment in a devolved situation. So I just wonder, it's all very well to have all the aspirations that we do, but realistically, given that particular elephant in the room, what is it that you foresee in terms of your call for spending and more houses and more this, more that? Where is that? What budget is that to come from?
Well, house building would be a capital expenditure, so we would want to ensure that the choices that the Scottish Government does have, they're putting into the places that are going to have the most impact. And it is not realistic to expect the Scottish Government to plug the gaps that are being created by the rollout of universal credit, the changes to the welfare reform. I think there's some positive words coming forward just now about what the Scottish social security system will look like. But obviously it remains to be seen in terms of how that will roll out. But I do think it forces some tough choices on the Scottish Government and Scottish local authorities to determine how best to target what resources they do have. And from our perspective, one of the best choices they can make is to protect frontline services that prevent homelessness, that prevent poor health, that prevent drug and alcohol addiction. I think it's something else we haven't really touched on is the addictions crisis, which is absolutely impacting on housing and homelessness too. So within the limited envelope that Scottish public bodies have available to them, we would certainly advocate that they prioritise rather than trying to spread their money kind of too thinly across too many priorities.
Okay, anybody else want to opine? No? Well, I just think it is important, if you have a balance sheet, you've got to look at the entirety of it. It's not really very practical to look only at one bit. You've got to have the whole bit, otherwise you're not going to effect practical solutions, which I'm sure everybody is concerned to achieve. And picking up on one other issue that was discussed that the convener raised on the important issue of adaptations, I wonder, and I know that this is an area of interest that the committee has, and I just wonder, given your experience of the sector, do you feel that there would be ways to have a smarter approach to housing adaptations, to have it better managed perhaps and accelerate the process, because it is the cause of a very significant blockage in terms of people being able to live in their homes. Do you have any... Do your organisations focus on that to any degree at all, or is it an area of activity that you'll be starting to look at in more detail, because it does impact on people's experience in their home?
From a rights perspective, when people are trapped in a home that's unsuitable and either can't be adapted or they're failing to access adaptations, so as a rights-based body, we seek to give them, give those individuals representation to ensure that they can access usually a move house, which is not ideal if the home itself could be adapted. So that's where we're seeing it. I'm afraid I don't have a off the cuff answer to you in terms of how adaptations can be better delivered, but it's certainly not going to be an area where we can expect to see savings over the coming years, because the demographics are only going in one way.
I think it comes back to maybe that discussion we had earlier around actually that interface between the kind of housing and other services, and how can your health service and other services actually recognise the benefits. If we can support anyone to stay in their home longer, that will put the kind of evidence is startling. Actually, that will undoubtedly release massive savings and support, and it's an outcome that everybody wants. Unfortunately, kind of much like God, I don't have that. I can't prescribe actually what that model looks like, but that's the direction of travel. Actually, seeing that other services that would benefit from supporting people to stay in their own home are willing to kind of support the funding, because, as you said, the money isn't there, but having the health service invest in that would deliver on their outcomes,
Okay. In terms of perhaps a more positive final round-up in terms of my questions, so looking at ways that we can progress matters, I think reference has been made already to joint working where relevant, shared services approach, and certainly I think that has a lot of mileage in it. I don't think we're nearly as far down that road as we could be, given the size of Scotland. So I noted from Shelter's paper the reference to the Scottish Empty Homes partnership, where you've had such an example of joint working across local authority boundaries, and perhaps you could expand on that a wee bit, and then if anybody else would like to chip in to see if they can come up with any examples of where they might think shared working with local authorities and indeed with other public sector organisations may help deliver some of the things you all wish to see.
So Shelter Scotland, we host the Empty Homes Partnership. It's something which is, receives funding from the Scottish Government, but the real success of it has been the engagement of local authorities. Those local authorities that get on board and have an Empty Homes officer, become part of a network, are able to share best practice, and they are seeing new homes returned into the system. Not always for social rent. Very often it is for it's to move them on, because we see the impact they have on the local community to have a derelict or vacant property, and very often it's quite small sums of money that private owners are needing people who either inherited a property, don't have the cash at hand to be able to bring it forward. And it's been a very positive form of engagement with local authorities, where they see the benefit, they can address it and usually for the cost of one post in a local authority, or sharing a post. We've seen between some local authorities, or some local authorities it's just a part-time post. They can make a real multiplier effect in terms of that investment. And we think it's also a model of that centralised network that's supported from the middle, that shares best practice. It's a model that could be applied to private landlord officers similarly to drive up that best practice, that shared services model, whether that's hosted by a landlord organisation or someone else. So it's been a real success. Unfortunately, not every local authority has yet joined up, but there's lots of good positive conversations, and it's actually making a business case that makes the difference, not making an appeal to some sort of moral obligation. They can see the financial benefits to their local area.
Good. Yes.
I've just come in on quite a practical issue with regards to building control. I mentioned previously the length of time that it takes to receive a building warrant, and we know of some examples of local authorities that are particularly under pressure, and they are effectively using other local authorities then when maybe not under quite so much pressure to provide some of those building control services. So again, it is happening, not formally, not through a statute, but there is definitely that informal working, and it is having an impact.
Two very quick examples. We've done some research a couple of years ago looking at how we can better connect community planning with spatial planning, and there was some things coming out of that, very simple things, but things that can be done quite quickly around how we can better join up community engagement processes, because different departments across local authorities and different public sector organisations will ask communities very, very similar questions a lot of the time, and then go back to them quite frequently. So if there's a way we can join up our engagement exercises, then take away the intelligence and information from that for each, that could be useful. Another one is there's some interesting stuff developing just now around trying to connect planning and health. West Lothian Council are piloting health impact assessments and are looking to see how that can be developed as an early adopter New Public Health Scotland approach as well. So there are some things happening there which I think can be really quite substantially useful as we progress.
I certainly like the sound of the last example you gave, because obviously in the planning process the impacts on local health provision, certainly as far as my constituency is concerned, are always a key issue that is raised. Lastly, very briefly, when the Robertson Trust gave evidence last week, they highlighted their social bridging finance approach as one route to fund partnership working, and I just wonder if you're aware of that approach, and if you have any views at this point. And if not, it would be helpful to the committee if you could have a look at what they do in that regard, and get back to us if you have any thoughts, because it seemed to us quite an interesting approach, and it'd be good to get practitioners' views on that. Great, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
So the evidence was presented, and then you can see the committee discussion we had on it, so you can just see how the discussion was framed. I've got time for a brief question from you, Kenny.
Have
Yes.
got the same time as everybody else?
Indeed. No, it just, but I'm not being funny, we are slightly running over, so Kenny, would you
Right,
like
okay,
to come
I'll
in?
try and keep it fairly brief. Okay, Callum, in your submission, paragraph 2.1, you say the provision of affordable housing is a key role to play in tackling poverty and child poverty in particular, and you talk about 15% of households living in absolute poverty, increasing to 18% where housing costs are taken into account. Should that not be relative poverty? It's
Sorry,
not
I don't
South
have
Sudan,
the,
for
sorry, I
example.
don't have the paper at me.
Okay, it's just for clarification. But we then go on, in 3.1, you talk about budget cuts. You say between 2013-14 and 2019-20, over 6 years, this has reduced local government spending by an average of £160 per head, £32 in North Ayrshire, going up to £572 in Aileen Shire, and that's obviously a consequence of the £14.8 billion cuts cumulatively to the Scottish budget over 8 years, and the prioritisation of the NHS, which means, as was pointed out with the panel early on, a squeeze between local government, between NHS prioritisation and the Scottish budget reduction impacting on local government. Now, you then go on to your recommendations, and the issue, of course, is that in terms of your recommendations, with that backdrop, you've suggested that housing subsidy levels should be revised with input from stakeholders, but you don't say what they should be revised to. You talk about considering local taxation, I take it to increase funding, but there's no reference as to what should be done with local taxation if we're to increase funding, and you go on to longer term financial certainty. Now, just one further point, Convener, before I let Callum come in. We mentioned disabled adaptations. Now, 7 years ago, you came to the Finance Committee when I was convener. Everybody used to come and say, we want more money for X, Y, Z. You were the only person I recall actually coming and saying, look, we think there should be more money for disabled adaptations. And how that would be funded is by increasing the age at which, you worked for Age Scotland at the time, is by increasing the age at which people got their concessionary fare from 60 to 65. So we're saying we'll save money on this, spend it on that. John Swinney went away. He decided we won't raise the concessionary fare age, but we'll increase disabled adaptations by 25%. So you got a win there. It's not been increased since, it has to be said, but that was a real important win. So why is it here, I feel frustrated that you've come here setting out the situation really well, Chartered Institute Housing, but there is no real concrete detail as to how we address the issue financially. I mean, you know, as I've said, how much more should be spent, you know, on subsidies, what local taxation should be considered, etc. So I wonder if you can perhaps fill in some of these details.
So, I mean, I think on the point of subsidy, so the committee knows we've got an imbalance in the level of subsidies between kind of RSLs
Yes,
and
indeed.
local authorities, and I think it's not for CIH or any one organisation here to predetermine what that rate should be. It has to be negotiated and discussed with the Scottish Government, and what we need to do is actually, what are the ambitions that the Scottish Government has for the housing market when we look at the state of the market and actually how we want to address the crisis in housing, and actually, and as we've discussed today, and recognising what housing can contribute towards a kind of social and economic outcomes. That's the process in which we need to determine the kind of budget. It's not for us to, while going through that process, it's difficult for us to say we expect the kind of subsidy rate to be, you know, remain at the same level, or, you know, increase in parity to, you know, £70,000 per home each for each home. On the kind of local taxation, I think there is a absolute. We don't have a predetermined model about what local taxation looks like. We have a couple of principles that would guide that. It has to be, you know, provide a kind of stable income base for local authorities and be raised as equitably as possible. It's not the kind of purview.
Okay. I understand that. It is frustrating because, I mean, Mr McRae, and you mentioned earlier on in terms of item 5 on your own submission, you know, you said the funding base for councils is too narrow and too tightly controlled. When asked about that, you said you don't have a view on what the system should be, but surely it's important for people giving evidence to have a view, because we have to make recommendations to ministers, and it's okay to say we should have a basket of additional local taxation, but we know that there are people in this committee who with their colleagues will fight in tooth and nail, for example, this afternoon against just such a suggestion, which is that local government has a working place parking levy imposed. So can you help the committee by providing suggestions as to what some of these taxes should be? Because otherwise, how are we meant to make recommendations to ministers on how they should, how we could impact on local government funding for affordable housing and other things if we don't get recommendations from the people who are giving us evidence?
I would have to recommend that there are property-based taxes when it comes to housing. That the wealth that is generated from planning consents is shared between the public and the private sector. But I think what is required is a clear understanding from across the political spectrum as to what the basket of taxation models that people are open to are going to be, because what we have seen is the long-term council tax freeze combined with the prioritisation of the NHS and national spending has put a squeeze on available funding elsewhere. And if we are to go down a route of no ring fencing, then local authorities need to have similar flexibility to fund their priorities. So, similar to Callum, I would say we could certainly express principles, but I think it is a political choice ultimately, and it's not a role for third sector bodies to get into the political debate. But we can express the principles we think that would support a well-functioning, equitable housing system.
I'm not necessarily saying you get in a political debate, but you should be saying, you know, for example, we think if you're going to suggest that we expand the funding base for local authorities, why not say we think this XYZ should be considered because it will bring in, you know, XYZ amount of funding in this, and it could be used for such and such. It's not necessarily, you know, do you know what I mean? I think.
Well, I think my thought was by saying, you know, we should be looking at things like land value and the gain to be made there. But part of the problem is we don't have access to quite a lot of the information that would allow us to inform that specific, you know, the specificity of that. You know, what monitoring do we do of Section 75 orders, for instance, to ensure that the anticipated public benefit is actually delivered on? These are I think there is a risk that we pull one thread and we lose sight of, you know, as we talked about, other non-statutory services in other parts of the public sector do have a consequential impact on the provision of local services, especially in housing and homelessness. So I think the recommendations we would make are that there is a role for property taxation, there is a role for land value gain to be captured within the system, but it has to be balanced against what are the expectations that local authorities have placed on them and what flexibility do they require to deliver those priorities.
Okay, and just Ms. Kell, do you have something you want to comment on in terms of funding?
Well, I think the issue for us with regards to for example, Section 75 contributions and others, in terms of the financial viability of delivering homes, there's only a certain inherent value in that. And if you're looking continually for additional contributions towards infrastructure, additional contributions towards schools and education, I get all of that, and that's why I think we need this joined-up approach, because continually expecting the private sector to be continuing to pay for that as well, that's not realistic either, because there's only a certain amount of value in any one plot. So I think it's just back to this a genuine look at the whole system, and the role of the public sector and the tax base that it can generate, and the role of the private sector, and jointly how they can then be delivering and tackling some of these big, expensive issues such as infrastructure.
Okay, and Mr. McLaren?
Yeah, I think we've tried in our submission and this morning to set out some very practical ways of just trying to generate income through one through, as I've said earlier on, through planning fees. I've also talked about land value capture. It's something we've always been interested in. We want to see how that's modelled best, to see how it could work, what model would work best within a Scottish context. But yeah, there's something there. And I think the other thing we've talked about is almost trying to think about how we can reconfigure public sector budgets to try and make sure that some of the preventative spend can be funded through from some of those who would benefit from it.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for that, Convener.
That's very good, and I think I'm going to draw this session to a close, but can I thank the four witnesses today for both answering on your own papers and giving us some wider views. I think it's been really helpful this morning. What I'm now going to do is to suspend our committee briefly to allow the witnesses to change over. Thank you very much. Our second panel this morning and introduce Professor Kenneth Gibb, University of Glasgow, and Professor James Mitchell, University of Edinburgh. And can I thank you both for your submission. We're keen to move on to questions and really to kick off with the first one. I'll kick off with just a broad question. Do you think the current financial settlements and powers enable councils to invest effectively in preventative spending measures? Don't know who would like to kick off.
I'll start.
Thank you.
What we've tried to do in this, in the written evidence, I think, is suggest a kind of, to some extent, a kind of radical challenge and try to set out reasons why we think that the underlying financial model and the governance structures between the interdependent central and local government in Scotland needs to be radically changed over a period of time, reflecting a range of things which are in the paper, and they are to use Kenny's words in the last session, principles rather than a lot of evidence, but we're about starting a conversation, you might say. I think it definitely does challenge the principle of trying to increase preventative spending. One of the areas that we pick up on is the absence of multi-year planning, multi-year funding. The present proposals, as I understand it, which try to move towards some degree of multi-year planning, will not integrate capital and revenue budgeting, which is obviously a further hindrance to doing those preventative things. As was said in the earlier session, it's a lot easier to think about breaking down silos within local government if you've got that planning horizon to work with, but also, critically from what we've been seeing in the written evidence, if you have some more discretion and you're empowered in order to do some of these things, which instead we've had this long-term narrowing of discretion.
Thank you. And James, did you want to come in?
Yeah, can I pick up on the prevention point? I think it's fair to say that local government has always engaged in prevention in its work. Hasn't always been badged as such, but much work that's done by local government has that function. I would argue as much, if not more so, than the National Health Service. So, for example, leisure and recreation hasn't always been badged as prevention, but it is preventative. There's no doubt at all about that. It's important in terms of mental health, in terms of physical health, and will therefore, we surmise, prevent certain ailments and illnesses. One of the great challenges, of course, with prevention is the causal, proving the cause and effect. But I think there is undoubtedly and continues to be a huge amount of work that local government does that is preventative. However, I think in the current financial situation, as we're confronting cuts, those matters which are cut first are the non-statutory obligations. And my deep concern here is that that means that many of the areas which are affected will be those areas which are preventative. I think one of the points I've long made about prevention is that there's not really it's very difficult to kind of statutorily enforce prevention. I don't think that's even if we try to put it into statute, I think it'd be very difficult. Hence, I think the role that local government plays in these other areas is vital, and I do worry about the trends that we're seeing. I think it's undermining prevention.
Yeah, I think that echoes evidence we've had over the last few sessions. Everybody agrees prevention is critical, it's cost effective, but actually if it's, particularly if it's in a non-statutory function, it's vulnerable to cuts. Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Graham, you have the follow-up question.
Yes, and it's just sort of based on your evidence, really, where you talk about a need to reverse the long-term process of disempowering local government, increasing local discretion. You go on to say that there should be more shared responsibilities. We, of course, as a committee, have looked at IJBs and how they're not really working very well at the moment. So I wonder if you've got any ideas of how that could be improved, and what is it you actually mean by the long-term process of disempowering local government?
Okay. Where to start? I've long used this phrase of the Rubik's Cube of local government, and this idea that you can't really separate out convincingly the functions and service distribution between central and local government from the way things are funded, from the geography of how we do government in the country. And I think trying to make changes in some areas without making complementary changes elsewhere can be a recipe for problems. And the IJBs and the well understood principles that underlie health and social care integration has taken place in a context where local government has been having these issues that we've been talking about in chat, and they are clearly challenged by. So it's perhaps not surprising that there is considerable variation across the country in the effectiveness of that. I've got a PhD student who often likes to say that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think the cultural issues between the NHS and local government are very important in that respect at local level. So those heterogeneities and experience don't really surprise me.
Yeah, in terms of the long term, and I think we mean really long term, going back decades. Tomorrow, actually, I'm at COSLA's conference in conversation with Sir Neil McIntosh, and we're going to be talking about that very point, about the long term. And of course, Sir Neil goes back to his days in local government in the 1960s through the 70s and 80s into the 90s. And actually, what he will do tomorrow, we've had a long conversation about that, is actually show the way in which local government has been disempowered. And it continued post-devolution. The Mackintosh Commission that was established in 1998, I think it was reported in 99, argued that we needed to have a new relationship between central and local government, mutual respect, parity of esteem. We needed to address the financial disempowerment back then. The evidence suggests that the evidence is clear, that disempowerment has not been addressed. And it comes in the form of taking away the autonomy of local government to raise revenue. You know, it's not that long ago. So I remember the days when 50% of revenue that was spent by local government was raised by local government. Also, the way in which central government has gradually over time essentially told local government what it ought to do, really essentially creating local administration rather than local government. There's less autonomy. So I think there's been a number of different factors that have happened over a very long period of time. And I think, for me, one of the great sadnesses is that we didn't really take the Mackintosh report. That was a cross-party report. This committee, or at least its predecessor, looked at that report in 2000 and said, this is what we should be doing. 20-odd years on, and we're still here. So I think we need to reverse that and do it urgently, which is what I would say. In terms of IGBs and such, I think one of the issues here is that integration, coordination comes in different forms. You get minimalist forms and you get maximalist forms. All too often, I think, when it comes to the kind of approach we require, and which Christie, I was a member of the Christie Commission, we argued for, was a more maximalist approach than we've seen. At the end of the day, bringing chiefs around the table to try and agree on broad outcomes is good, but it's not enough. Ultimately, they go back into their silos and carry on doing largely what they did before. This is particularly the case when money is short. It's my money, it's not yours. And we get into a really tricky situation. So it's actually much more difficult now, I think, to get effective coordination, cooperation, integration in these kind of times than we would in if you like, the good old times that we did experience at one point.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite clear to me that you've got people working in silos who are not willing to sort of give up what they've got. You've got sort of health boards versus councils, and it's never going to work unless somebody bangs heads together.
Hope that Public Health Scotland will do that. I'm delighted to see the Chief Executive has been appointed. I'm delighted it is Angela Leach. I think she'll do a good job. I do think that knocking heads together is important, but I also think that we need to think about how we incentivise that kind of change in approach, and whether our institutional structures encourage or discourage. And at the moment, I think they don't help, frankly. The kind of, it's my money, it's not yours. And in a sense, I think people are behaving, from their own point of view, quite rationally in doing that. It's not because people are bad people. Public service, we're very lucky to have really good people. So I think we need to give a bit more thought as to how we can encourage change in that respect. But something like Public Health Scotland, I think, will be important, but I think we need a lot more than that.
How would you incentivise it then?
Well, you could actually go further than incentivisation. You could actually start, for example, top slicing, taking money out, saying it won't belong to this organisation. Another way, coming back to local government funding, is to look at the responsibilities, the competencies of local government. And there may well be things that local government could and should be doing, but need to be resourced properly, that are currently being done elsewhere. I think we do need to have a serious debate on what we mean by public health, prevention, and ask ourselves whether really at the moment our institutional structures are well placed to deliver. And I don't think they are. Now that's a debate I think that is currently, to some extent, I have to say to a limited extent, underway under the local governance review. My great sadness with respect to the review, and I should declare an interest here as well because I've been working closely with COSLA on this, is I don't think health has engaged as much as is essential.
Can I add to that? I mean, there's also, to me, there's also broader opportunities for central government to incentivise local government. One example of that might be to try to introduce forms of payment by result mechanisms, but in particular to say, here's some objectives we want you to achieve, which would be about breaking down silos, working collaboratively across government departments in local government, and then saying success of meeting these targets will give you access to capital credits. You know, you'll get a bigger capital budget as a result of meeting certain objectives, or some other mechanism like that. But capital budget is quite an attractive way of doing it. Obviously has less of an immediate impact on revenue, but the actual principle of also, for instance, one of the things that we were very struck by in putting this paper together is this notion that local government is meeting the cost of inflation by and large, that it's also meeting fully some of the demand increases that it's getting, and that's not being accommodated for by this population-driven grant increases fully. Is there a way of sharing that and again incentivising that, so if savings and efficiencies have been made elsewhere, that there can be some compensation by central government meeting some of the costs of inflation or some of these demand increases? That we've talked about sharing a lot, sharing services, sharing the burden, working in partnership. That's the kind of real consequence, manifest consequence of it.
We actually presented a paper on that very theme to whenever it was, the Finance Committee some years ago on the incentivisation and the kind of long-term planning, which we could certainly dig out again for you if you want.
Well, that would be good to see. But is payment by results not just ring fencing by another name?
Well, but if you want to incentivise things, you've got to make clear links. I think. If you want to deliver some form of preventative work, which is about bringing sub-parts of a local government together to work, you're trying to fix on a certain target. So yes, you are focusing resource in a certain place, but that's clearly your objective in the first place.
But you've complained in your paper about disempowering local government, and then you're arguing for essentially more ring fencing, which is disempowering.
Well, we're arguing for partnership, which is not the same thing as it's not the same thing as ring fencing. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different issues around that.
That is a fair point up to a point, and if that was all we were arguing for, and we're not talking about the entire budget being treated in that way, there needs to be a great deal more autonomy and discretion given to local government. There are some areas where ring fencing, we think, should be abandoned. Take, for example, kind of the way at the centre. And I don't think it's just the government, it's the Parliament too. It kind of has got this thing about teacher numbers and such like. There's evidence that may not always be the most appropriate way of spending money. It may be in certain authorities, but maybe not in all. And that comes back to the point about local autonomy. So we need to think very hard about that dimension. So I think the Rubik's Cube kind of analogy, even though I struggle with it myself, I think it's probably...
I certainly do. Can we not use that again?
Okay. The point being that there are so many different parts to this whole business. And I don't think we should dismiss any, and we need multiple kind of tools, as it were, as we move forward. But fundamentally, it must be a partnership. It must be really mutual respect, parity of esteem, and there must be greater autonomy.
Okay. Thanks, Convener.
Yes.
Comment on that?
Yeah, just a supplementary. Thanks, Convener. I mean, in terms of disempowerment, I was just thinking back in the 60s, my parents bought their first flat. They got a corporation mortgage and they get their electricity and gas supplied by the council. So it shows you how much we've actually moved. But do you agree that it's time to declutter? I mean, what we have is a situation in Scotland, where we've got health boards, local authorities, integrated joint boards. We've got community planning partnerships. Now we've got city and regional deals, etc. Often you get people, the same people going from one meeting to the next meeting to the next meeting with all these different hats on. Do you feel that decluttering would actually allow not only a more efficient and effective use of resources, perhaps merging health and local government, which has been my bonnet for years, as you know, Professor Mitchell, but also it would allow the people who are actually represented to know just exactly how society works more effectively, because who among Scotland's 5 million people actually know about the structures in which they actually live at the moment?
I think there's something in that, the notion of decluttering. And I think in each case of these examples you've given, there's been a good argument for moving in that direction on their own. But we've approached it in an ad hoc way.
It's layering, yeah.
And this is where I think Neil McIntosh, you should really have Neil here, is really interesting, because his argument is that what we've done over the course of the last century and into this century is every 20-odd years we have a major review and look at it afresh. And he thinks it's time, it really is time to do that. And I think that decluttering could be part of it. And that's where I would hope that the local governance review will go. I hope we do look at that. And that's not to say at this stage we should get rid of this board or that board. I do think there's another point, and that is the local accountability angle on this. I spent a lot of time last month's year or so going around Scotland looking at this whole business of local governance and speaking to councillors and publics and such like. And it was striking how often I heard the point being made that local councillors are often approached about anything locally, including GP services for which they have no responsibility. And so I think that needs to be part of that conversation. We need to find ways of ensuring we do have a better way of having that local accountability. And that may well, I think, speak to the kind of decluttering approach that you would advocate. I do think that we could also, we should be able, in that process, to make savings. We still do quite a lot of things in duplicate, quadruplicate and such like. And so I think we could move that way. And we now feel like we have the technology now to do that as well. But we're kind of stuck with institutional structures from a previous time, which served well at that time. I don't think they're doing so now.
I think that accountability point's really well made, actually. But one of the other things we talk about in the paper is the potential benefits or the underachieved benefits so far of joint working across local governments. And certainly my limited involvement in the city region in Glasgow, on the housing side, there is some really interesting joint work starting to happen, and it's not clear to me that would have happened in the absence of the city region. But that doesn't mean that, as you rightly say, that the people out there really understand what these different governance structures are and the accountabilities and who's accountable to them in what different way.
Well, COSLA always says that it's there to help share best practice, because that's a thing that many committees on this Parliament actually push. And I want to come in later on. Just one thing. What is a wicked system, which you've mentioned in paragraph 6? You say we require more explicitly systems thinking around interdependence, complexity and incentive structures. This is especially true of tackling wicked problems.
Right. Well, two things. The idea of wicked problem is a planning. It came out of planning in America in the 1960s, and the idea is that there are just some issues that, because of value divergence between the different stakeholders, they simply can't agree on where to go with a policy because of some causal issues where it's really hard to understand the root nature of the thing, and some administrative technical difficulties. It's hard to work out how to get there. There are just some problems which are fundamentally more difficult to address, actually to define, than there are with others. As we have tackled some of our more non-wicked problems in the last 50, 60 years. The planners in the 60s were arguing, well, actually, we're now having these much more fundamental issues like inequality and things of that kind, which are just more difficult to get value agreement around or understand the causal natures of what's causing the thing. So I guess what we're saying is that this relationship between the different functions of local government vis-a-vis Scottish Government and also the funding structures that we have are really difficult to disentangle, back to the Rubik's Cube.
A teacher of English would have a heart attack looking at this Americanism, just imposed in here.
Very widely used. Apologies for using
exactly.
it. It's kind of it's commonly used amongst public sector practitioners as well. Can I just distinguish between tame and wicked problems? The tame problems are ones that are easily dealt with. No, that's what the literature says. Yeah. Basically, the ones that are kind of, you do X and it's solved. Yeah. You do Y and it's solved. Wicked problems are not like that. They're much more complex, they're deep-rooted, they require multiple approaches, and there's not often an agreement, and they always involve lots of different agencies coming together. So you break your leg, you go to the hospital, it will be dealt with. That's a tame problem. It might not seem tame to you if you break your leg, but that's a tame problem. Okay. Poverty, there's a really wicked problem. Hopefully that explains it.
Deep-rooted
would
have saved us this conversation, actually. Never mind.
Right. Okay. Well, I want to link this back to the National Performance Framework and think about how national objectives then link to local levels. And I want to think particularly about a challenging issue or an emergency, which is the climate change agenda. Because most of our discussions are really going to focus on existing challenges and demographic change. But how do we see local government contributing on climate change, which is going to require resource rethinking? It's a key objective from the National Performance Framework. We've got a new Climate Change Act. How does local government step forward and deliver on something that is going to be a major challenge with annual budgets?
Well, I probably answer that by answering a slightly different question, I suppose. One of the reasons why I think the reversing of disempowerment in the sense of giving more funding powers to local government and more discretion to local government is partly wedded to the belief that greater discretion and resource will actually lead to more innovation itself, and that we shouldn't believe that central government has a monopoly of wisdom in these matters, and actually we need to let other actors have a go at working out their own local solutions, and local government is actually potentially well placed to do that, provided it has the capacity and the capabilities to do that. So at one level, as a perfectly general proposition, I think giving local government more of these powers can lead to more innovation and experimentation, which we should be in favour of.
James, you anything on that one?
Okay, I'm no expert in this, and I know, convener, you are more expert than I am in this, and so I think the only thing I would say is that there will have to be national and local responses, and that conversation is important. Articulation of the relationship, what should be set nationally, and what might be more appropriate locally, because different local authorities will be facing or have the opportunity to address these issues differently. So, without being an expert in that particular area, I would be reluctant to say much more than that. Apologies for that.
I'm certainly, from the last set of questions, I'm thinking about what the incentives might be, where it's new things, where it's sets of skills that aren't there at the moment. So yeah, that's good.
There's where the centre can play a part, in that it can support and encourage financially and otherwise, and share information. I'm again, without specifics, I'd feel.
I was very struck last night watching the BBC News that a local authority in England won these architectural design awards for building passive house council housing, which I think is a really interesting example of a local government-led, in actually a slightly more hostile environment for council housing than in Scotland, has done such a remarkable piece of work. And I think that's an example of innovation and experimentation which does pursue these, and it was very much in the language of the climate emergency, wasn't it? So,
yeah. Okay, Graham, I think you're the next person on my list.
No, I'm happy for others to come in.
Okay, on that case, Alexander, you're next.
Can I look at the pressures of demographics? Because there have been huge pressures on a number of councils where they've seen massive increases in how that is to be affected and challenged. And can I ask about the capacity for the third sector and also the private sector to come in to try and alleviate some of those pressures? It would be good to get your views on how that goes forward.
I think the third sector, as you know, already play a significant part in all of this. Ultimately, the challenge for the third sector is not dissimilar to that for local government, and that's about resourcing, and it's about long-term planning and being able to ensure that whatever is being offered isn't just going to disappear and they're going to have to spend all their time trying to get grants. I do have a slight concern that what we tend to find is that when in a period of cuts, centre cuts to local government cuts to the communities and to the third sector, and or else basically we dump the problem, right? We'll let you do it. Devolution of penury. So I think we've got to be very careful to avoid that. But again, it comes back to that point about partnership. I mean, the one thing we do know about the elderly population, it's seen as a problem, but actually it's also part of the solution. We know that particularly older women play a huge part in providing both for families and communities, and that's something that should certainly be. I think one thing we could do more is celebrate that more. And certainly there's evidence across the world that that's the case. The World Health Organization has made that point frequently. But I do think there's the one thing I would also stress is that this is where I think locally things have to be decided. And this is where I think local government needs to have the discretion to determine how best to do it. There are some areas where there would have to be capacity building. As for the private sector, again, I mean, I think the private sector plays a huge part already, and will continue to do so. And I think the issue is about regulation, ensuring that we have appropriate regulations in place to meet standards and so on and so forth. But again, I have no objection to, in principle, to private involvement, but I would want to ensure that it was for the public good.
Exactly. And there's also the views on some of the funding models that come into that process. Have you got any views on that? And then Professor Keane.
I was going to make the point that I was very impressed with some work that Richard Best did about 7 or 8 years ago, where he was looking at town centre living for older people in countries like Denmark and Sweden and Holland. And that sort of set off a lot of ideas around the challenges of trying to repair and remake our sort of ailing town centres, and the notion that they could be more, they could be master planned and redesigned, redeveloped with obviously the great support of the private sector to try to find high amenity, accessible living for older people who are downsizing, empty nesting, etc. And I think that is, as James says, that's a sort of classic kind of local partnership model, which could could make use of people's own housing equity, but could also make use of local government capital funding and private sector investment.
And the ideas that we've had recently, that some of the City Deal money is going to be used specifically for some of that, that's been looked at this government and at the UK government as to how it can be advanced. But the role of as I say, the private sector coming into that can make a massive impact, and some of the the university side of things as well, where they've seen some developments as to what they want to try and affect and support. But it's trying to get that balance that we get. As you rightly say, it's all about safeguards. It's all about ensuring that you have that ability to make sure that the things are going to work effectively for the communities. But as I say, with the demographics that some councils have, it's the percentages are quite eye-watering, what they're going to have to contend with. And that would mean that some may have to do something slightly different because one size is not going to fit them all. There may be some areas that they can work together and there is partnership working. But for some of them, it is going to be a massive, massive issue that they're going to have to contend with for decades to come, not just the next 2 or 3 or 4 year budgets that they have to manage. It's going to have a massive impact on their stability and even their survival into some respects as to how they can continue. So you know, when you're looking at efficiency savings and redesign and all of that, it would be good to think well, of what your views are about how that should be tackled.
Well, I mean, I think there's lots of propositions come forward when we start talking about these things. One is that we should look at global evidence. That everybody around the world are facing these things. Some people have got longer term experience, like in Japan, of these sorts of issues. There are lessons we can learn about what we probably shouldn't do and what, as well as what we could do, and put that in the local context of this kind of funding package and set of intergovernmental relations that we've got. But I also I'm increasingly impressed by kind of design thinking and the idea that we should actually work with the people affected directly to try and get a much better sense of what they want and what wouldn't be suitable, and bring them with you to allow you to test out different sorts of ideas.
Good.
Right, thanks. Andy, you were going to come in with some questions.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks indeed for your papers, very thought-provoking. I mean, this is pre-budget scrutiny, so to an extent we're just looking at the budget, and we'll be actually talking about much bigger pictures, but I think that's really important, obviously, to talk about the bigger picture, because Professor Mitchell, you talked about the Mitchell review, Macintosh review. Maybe we'll have a Mitchell review one day. Macintosh, we then, out of that, had the Curley review that looked at, there was multi-member wards and pay for councillors, I think, as I recall. And the Burt review that was killed before it was even published, and the Local Tax Commission that's got nowhere as well. And I just want to refer to your kind of underscoring points in paragraph 4 of your paper, the key points where you talk about the degree to which local government has discretion over the setting of local tax rates. I mean, the council tax has remained unreformed since 1992, essentially. It's been tweaked a wee bit. Non-domestic rates were centralised by Mrs Thatcher and never changed either. So in essence, I think only Malta, Romania and Bulgaria have got less responsibility for the local fiscal environment than local government does. Do you think that we need to have, I mean, there's a practical question and I suppose a more principled question here, but do you think we need to have a kind of a 5-10-year programme through the local governance review and other things of re-empowering local government? Or do you think we need to do, as you were suggesting, Professor Mitchell, Mr. Neil Macintosh said, a big review every 20 years? Because my kind of feeling is that big review every 20 years has never been terribly good. It's been quite politicised, and it's built in a lot of politics into the system that we're still living with a legacy of.
That's a fair point. I think the kind of every 20 years or so, he was particularly keen on things like Wheatley type things, which got consensus he wasn't keen on. I'm not keen on what happened in the 90s. I don't think that's the appropriate way, because there wasn't enough. Not keen on the reforms in the 90s, because I think there was no consultation involved in that. I do think that whether it's, I don't think we can do it in a big bang, certainly not financially. I do think we've got to do this incrementally. I think it's always ill-advised to try and make big changes financially, but we need to also do it at pace because of the situation we're in. I think we need to have a sense of where we're trying to get to, and I think in the paper we make reference to an attempt over the long haul to get to a situation where about 50% of revenue spent is raised locally. I think that if it's not in that paper, it's somewhere else we've written that. Apologies, but that's the kind of approach we do need to have. And you're right, there've been a whole series of inquiries on finance. I do lectures and talks on this, and I've got a slide with a whole list of them over the years. And I guess for me, the frustration is that I don't think we need much more evidence. It's just a lack of political will. And we are outliers. We're kind of odd. And it's not just Scotland, it's the UK. We look pretty odd in international terms. And the OECD and other organisations have looked into this whole question. And I don't know, we could do with raising our eyes, I think, and as Ken was saying, look at some of the global evidence, because what we're doing is not working, and we're getting to a point where people keep saying cliff edge, and I think one of you asked one of the previous witnesses, well, what next? Well, it's obvious, you fall off the cliff. That's where we're heading, and unless we address this fairly urgently, in my view.
I think we can. We should try to phase this in over a period of years and do it in such a way that we dampen year-on-year impacts, so that they aren't so massively unpleasant either to certain groups or in certain places, if that's possible. That's a big task of implementation, but certainly phasing in local control and non-domestic rates over a period of years would on average across Scotland would bring us over 40% of locally raised funds. That's clearly a big challenge, and something that's such a long time ago since local government had power over non-domestic rates. It's quite a lot to contemplate, but they do benefit from local amenities. There are good reasons why we have business rates all over the world in different ways. Certainly, we would favour a better property land-based tax base as a whole for Scotland, and that would actually have other knock-on effects at a more macro scale, in that you could actually, for a level of tax revenue, you could reduce income tax, arguably, if you were taxing more land and property, more immobile factors of production rather than mobile labour. And I think there must be strong attractions in thinking about that over a long period of time as well. But the other thing that stands out, if you look at the international evidence, is how little tax powers local government has in the UK compared to other cities and other countries in the OECD, who often have 5, 6, 7 taxes at their disposal. They don't necessarily use them. They don't necessarily use them extensively, but that's quite a different context to even begin from.
Okay, thanks. Well, hopefully this afternoon we'll give them one more power, but we'll see where that gets. I just want to reflect on the political difficulties of doing this. You talked about wicked problems. So it seems that in the kind of long, slow disempowerment of local government, central government has embraced the opportunity to have more to be able to persuade the electorate that it can do things that previously it couldn't. So, for example, vote for us and we'll cut the council tax, even though it's not within our gift to count it. We have to persuade someone else to do it. Vote for us and we'll increase teacher numbers, even though we're not responsible for that. So how do we get over, because any government, I mean, we're doing pre-budget scrutiny, it doesn't really matter who the administration is, enjoys the powers it has, both for political reasons and for practical policy reasons. I mean, what's the evidence that an empowered local state, which has substantial autonomy and freedom and power and flexibility, can do things better, at least in the medium long term? It's not to say it always does everything right, but can do things better than the central state can, in terms of the kind of levers you're talking about pulling. I mean, is that fairly settled, that evidence, or is it contested?
I think there's always an issue here about the time period you're talking about. So the metaphor that I think is quite useful is thinking about Glasgow in the 1980s, when you had the biggest council housing department anywhere in the UK, who voluntarily gave up a lot of their housing to create the community-based housing sector, which was a tremendous success, and still is an amazing feat, which has not really been emulated elsewhere. And that did generate tremendous innovation and experimentation, and lots of lessons were learned about future ways of thinking about, non-private housing. So I think even in the difficult circumstances that Glasgow was in the 80s and 90s, it was able to do something really quite remarkable, really from its own, led by Glasgow, not led by the central state. That's not, so it's a metaphor. It's not exactly an exact example of what we're talking about, but I think, to be honest, I would imagine there are probably examples of good and bad practice with powerful local states. I think around the world, I think that's kind of inevitable, that there will be both. But that doesn't mean that in the current state of affairs, we can't use the way we think about setting up the structures and the incentives to try to give people the space to be more innovative and creative, without necessarily doing some of the things that would be less effective or less efficient. So it's not really, I'm not really answering the question.
I mean, it is to some extent contested, and certainly there's a literature on Latin America where there have been devolution of fiscal autonomy to regional government, which has certainly not worked. And part of the reason for that was that these units were ultimately not responsible for driving up huge debts and creating major problems. So I think one of the things you need to do if you're going to move to a more fiscally autonomous structure is fiscal responsibility has to be built into it. I mean, that's one of the big lessons, as it were, I think, particularly from the Latin American experience. A number of Latin American countries, really got themselves into difficulty, not just by what the centre state was doing, but the regional states were doing. In this country, that, in a sense, under the current arrangements, that wouldn't be possible because local authorities are not able to borrow to that extent. And I do think that that would be a factor that would have to be played into it. That said, I think in much of Europe, people would look at that question you posed and say, what are you on about? Because it's just alien to their understanding of how governance works. The attitude I've encountered is that, of course, it will work best. I have to say, I'm not sure it's been quite as tested as it ought to be, but there's a culture that assumes that decentralisation involves goods in as much as you get greater participation, greater efficiencies, greater local knowledge. But it is interesting that the kind of question you asked tends to be restricted to the UK. You don't tend to get that kind of question. And it may say something about the way in which we're very parochial, I think, in thinking about governance issues. But I would certainly concede that the Latin American experience has to be taken on board. But that's where there's fiscal responsibility. And I think we use the term responsibility as well in the paper. It's not just about autonomy. If you're just saying, right, you can do what you like, and then if you get yourself into trouble, we'll bail you out, that's not a good model.
Okay, and finally, I mean, I'm very interested in local government in the rest of the world. Part of the reason why it's generally more successful is it hasn't changed that much because of constitutional protections. But I mean, you mentioned, I just want to finish on this point, and it comes back to preventative spend, it comes back to the question of outcomes focus, it comes back to Professor Mitchell's point about how local government has essentially been doing preventative spend a lot of the time, and I think you raised the question of, the accountability to local people of primary care. We don't hear much about the local governance review. As parliamentarians, it's been announced there will be no major reforms this session. I think I've seen some papers with little cartoons. Give us a flavour of where that is and how committed you think the partners are to seriously thinking about not just local government, but the ability to bring in broader public services like police and health and all the rest of it to create a genuinely effective framework of local governance.
Well, I've been involved in it, and so I come at it from a particular angle. There are different strands to the review, and I think one of the cartoons you were talking about is the community empowerment strand. There was initially an attempt to kind of get out there, go beyond the formal structures, the institutions, but go into the communities. And there's been a lot of work done around that, gathering evidence and information. There's also been a lot of work with the institutions, but particularly local government. And I certainly was helping COSLA on that. And I do know that we wandered off across Scotland and invited lots of people to come along, public institutions. Tended to be councillors, council officials, police, Scotland were superb, fire and rescue service, superb in attending, participating, offering views. Health, not so much, frankly. And my own personal view on this may not be COSLA's official view, but my personal view is that was really disappointing. Because I think if we were to take local governance, not local government review, and it's a governance review, we must look at health as well. As I understand it, because this is where the politicians kind of make the decisions, not people like me, it was decided that there wouldn't be legislation, as you say, but the review would continue through this Parliament. And there are different strands of work underway, looking at 3 different forms of empowerment. That was following on COSLA's submission. Community empowerment, fiscal empowerment and functional empowerment. Community empowerment, I think, fairly straightforward. Fiscal empowerment is what we've been talking about largely today. Functional empowerment is really about the institutional structures, what should be given to local government, great discussions on power general competence and so on and so forth, about the relationships between the institutions, some of the questions that have arisen today. So I know there are these three strands currently operating. I've just been asked to sit on them, so I haven't attended any yet, and I look forward to seeing where we go with this. I don't know what the end point will be. I don't know what the product will be at the end. As I suspect there will be a series of proposals. It is COSLA and Scottish Government together. I imagine it will be something that this committee would be engaging with at some stage. I'm hopeful that this will be part of this process that Ken was talking about in terms of the changes that will have to be brought in over time. I think some of the changes that could be brought in don't require legislation. It could take some of the things we could do quite quickly. I also want to stress the one thing that I think is fundamentally important is if government thinks we could just move in terms of community empowerment without touching fiscal empowerment, then I think they're making a huge mistake, because each of these are interlinked. To do proper community empowerment takes resources, takes time, takes money. And I would fear that we might say, right, we'll dump wicked problems into our communities. We must not do that. So we must ensure that fiscal and functional empowerment goes hand in hand with community empowerment, is my view. And that's what I'll certainly be arguing for as often as I possibly can in whichever fora I'm invited to.
Okay, thanks very much.
It's Annabelle.
Yes, thank you, Convener, and good morning. Just briefly, I think we've had a very good, wide-ranging discussion. Two quick questions following on really from our discussion. So silo working, how does that get tackled? Because it always comes back to that. It always comes back to that. There's initiatives, they're good initiatives. It's all supposed to an extent, declutter the landscape, and then it seems to come up against a mentality of silo working. How do you see any solution to that?
We wrote a paper a few years ago, we blog about the problems of trying to get people to change the way that they work. And I think that at one level there's a kind of organisational level, and it really doesn't matter if it's local government or it's a charity or it's any other provider or stakeholder, but how do you create incentives for people to actually want to think preventatively? At the starting point, you've got to incentivise that. And so we ask questions about whether when people recruit new leaders and senior players, do they actually make prevention a key part of the job role? Is that what they interview about? Do they reward people behaving preventatively? And so there's a cultural thing here that isn't, even despite the way we talk about it so much and that all levels of government talk about it, there's still a kind of, there seems to be a lack of the silo mentality is such that the culture doesn't actually give encouragement for people to be that kind of creative and innovative in the first place. So, people aren't going to find ways round these silo structures and institutions if they're not actually really engaged with it in a creative way in the first place.
Okay. Mr. Professor Mitchell nodding, I take it.
Yeah, very much. I mean, I think one of the problems is we have these institutions, we appoint to these institutions in silos, we train in silos, and we generally work in silos. Where I think actually silos tend to break down positively is often at the very local level, at the kind of level of engagement with citizens, and that you do see people who work in different agencies coming together. And I think we need to think very long and hard in terms of local governance review, in terms of the decluttering, as to whether we need to do more there. I'm a strong believer that the three basic tools are sticks, carrots, and sermons. I think we've got a lot of sermonising. We've got to get away from silo-based approaches. I don't think we're kind of giving enough thought as to the institutional structures, in a sense, forcing that, and as you'll gather, we're kind of keen on incentivisation as best we can, and rewards and so on. It just, I've often asked public servants, politicians at the most senior level, when was the last time you saw someone be promoted or promoted someone because of their work in prevention? The response is generally, that's interesting, I think.
Yeah, indeed. One last quick question. What do you see 20 years' time? What's local government going to look like? An easy one here.
what do I think is going to happen, or what do I want? I mean, because they're not the same. I fear, I fear much we'll continue along this road with minor changes. I think there's just a lack of political will. And I think it's all too easy, with all due respect to members of this committee, for party politics to intrude and to get into a blame game. And blame game is damaging to all that I believe in terms of local government reform. But on an optimistic note, I also think that you guys will probably work together and come out with some real recommendations that are bold, radical, consensually, and have huge influence.
Any final comment, Chris?
I'm slightly more optimistic than maybe Andy was earlier about the future of local taxation. I think we're hearing a lot just now in the housing world, my other kind of area of interest, about this vision to 2040 and this notion that in the principles of the new housing system we will be trying to stabilise house prices, and we need levers to do that, and a really important levers is through local taxation, I think, and land value taxation and things like that. And as I say, for reasons I mentioned earlier, I think there's such a strong case for shifting the burden of taxation, or the nature of the tax base. I just think more people will become convinced of that.
Okay, thank you
very much. Kenny, you're desperate to get in.
Just one question,
Please.
actually. I mean, firstly, though, I would just say that I think it was the Blair government that actually saved Glasgow, I have to say, by writing off the £2 billion debt before, in terms of the housing stock transfer. Glasgow was drowning in debt and it had demolished half its stock. So credit where credit's due. I was very much involved in that and persuading the SNP to support that policy, and that's why I'm no longer a Glasgow MSP. But the question I'm asking is that you've talked about empowerment and all the rest of it, and baskets of taxes and reform and all the rest of it. If you think about reforming council tax, 40% of people might win out of that, 40% might lose, and 20% might be in the middle. The 40% who win won't necessarily thank you for it. The 40% who will lose out will hate you. So any administration that brings in such a radical transformation, you can talk about party politics all you like, but they're likely not to be in power or be damaged by bringing that in, unless we can get cross-party support on that, which is unlikely. And the public don't necessarily want empowerment. They would rather have fewer taxes but better services. They just see things from a different perspective from us. So how do you square the circle whereby you increase local government accountability and empowerment, give local government a basket of taxes without alienating the electorate, who over a decade have had to suffer austerity, very little in terms of improved standard of living, and will just see more taxes, more charges, coming their way for what they perceive as, something which maybe is just about bins, schools, and street lighting. So how do you look at it from that perspective and deliver the change that we need to deliver? Because I think we do agree. There's a lot of frustration. We agree to change things, but it's very difficult to do it in practical terms as opposed to theoretical terms.
Well, a number of things to say. I mean, I think that's the reality, and one recognises that, and it's really depressing. And it's also a kind of it's almost like taken to its extremes, like in a manifesto for kind of Nordic services with American taxes kind of problem. That if we don't make a more positive case for local services and for local autonomy and the benefits that can bring, we're kind of stuck to some extent. So there's lots of evidence in international evidence about property tax reform, which suggests how difficult it is when we move too incrementally and we only make little changes and we tinker with taxes. That if one is going to be bolder, then there's a whole job of education to be done. So there's this Canadian research which suggests that the only way to make really significant property tax reform is to really invest in the persuasion of it, and that's about politicians, but it's also about public meetings and town hall meetings and all of those sorts of things as well. So it's not easy, but that's another reason why these things have to be phased in over long periods of time. John Hill's in the housing and social policy world almost every policy reform you suggested required at least a 10-year phasing. And obviously you can only do that with complete political consensus around it, otherwise you can't guarantee you'll get to the end point. So it is very, very challenging, but I just think the entropy of the alternative is so bad that we must do what we can to avoid it.
I mean, when do you make change when you've not got public support? One is by building consensus and leadership, having the guts to lead on it. The other is crisis. You fall off that cliff edge. The trouble with that latter one is that what often emerges is suboptimal. It's not as good as it could have been if you'd done it by consensus. Perhaps we will get these changes because we're getting awfully close to that cliff edge that I kept hearing people referring to. It may be forced upon us.
Okay. Thanks very much, Convener.
Thank you. We have not mentioned Brexit this morning, which is probably a relief, but actually it's another element of that potential cliff edge. Can I thank you both very much for your thoughtful contributions and answers this morning? And can I suspend our session to enable the witnesses to leave? Thank you both very much indeed. Right. Can I call the committee back to order again? Next in front of us we have agenda item 3, subordinate legislation, and it's consideration of negative instrument 295 as listed on the agenda. Can I refer members to paper number 3? This instrument is laid under the negative procedure, which means that its provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul it, and no motions to annul have been laid. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the instrument at its meeting on the 1st of October this year and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. So do members have any comment on the instrument? Andy? Yep.
Yes, no, I was just delighted that we're going to allow bigger caravans. I think it's people of Scotland should be very grateful to Parliament. Look forward to bigger caravans.
Okay. And Graham?
Yes, as convener of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee, obviously we had a look at this, and I was surprised to see that you could be allowed bigger caravans in England than in Scotland. And I also wondered who actually enforces these regulations. Now, I'm not moving that we delay the decision. I think it makes perfect sense that we would allow a maximum size of caravans across the UK. That's obviously that makes sense, but some questions arose.
Okay, well, I don't see anyone else wanting to speak. We'll pick up that particular comment about implementation and enforcement, I think, and we'll seek some. Sorry, Clark was about to say something. The law will be changed, so there will not be enforcement changes? Be harmonisation. Does that answer your question, Graham?
Oh, it seems to me that if you have a maximum size of a caravan, if somebody puts a caravan that's beyond that maximum size, somebody has to take action. That's my own point.
Yeah, I think we should write a letter just to seek a bit of clarification in that, and then we can report back to our next meeting after the recess.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. I don't see anyone speaking against this motion, though. So I think on that basis, I invite the committee to agree that we don't wish to make any recommendations in relation to that instrument, except for that further clarification, which we can do while letting the instrument go through. We're all agreed? Thank you, colleagues. That ends the public part of the meeting, and I now move the meeting into private. Thank you.